My wife, may I present Glafira. Glafira will be staying with us. She is under my protection now.
Everyone in St. Petersburg said Duchess Miloslava Zarenkova had accepted it gracefully. She had smiled when Duke Vsevolod brought his mistress Glafira into their home. She had bowed her head. She had said nothing. Nothing. But on the night she quietly walked out of that grand, cold palace, she was carrying something Vsevolod didn't know about yet. Something that would change everything. Why did she stay silent for so long? What was she protecting? And when Vsevolod finally discovers the truth, will it destroy him or destroy her? This story is just getting started, and trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. If you're already hooked, please subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Because the moment you look away, that's exactly when everything falls apart. Miloslava had not always been this quiet. There was a time not so long ago when she laughed easily, when she hummed while braiding her hair and argued with her younger sister Darinka over whose turn it was to feed the horses. That was before St. Petersburg, before the Duke, before she learned that a woman's silence was often the only thing keeping her world from crumbling. She had grown up in a modest estate in Novgorod, the eldest daughter of a minor nobleman whose debts were louder than his name. Her father, Count Bronislaw Zarenkov, was a proud man with tired eyes and a habit of making promises he could not keep. He promised her mother comfort. He promised his creditors patience. And when Miloslava turned 19, he promised her hand to Duke Vsevolod Krasnomir without so much as asking if she wanted it. She remembered the morning he told her. She had been standing in the kitchen garden, pulling weeds from the soil with her bare hands, her nails dark with earth. Her father had called her name from the doorway, and something in his voice made her stomach tighten before he even spoke. She straightened. She listened. She did not cry. That was the first time she swallowed something that should have come out as screaming. Vsevolod was not a cruel man. That was the part that made everything harder. He was distant the way winter is distant. Not hateful, just cold. He had dark eyes that moved over her like she was furniture he had ordered and wasn't sure he liked. He was 41 to her 19. He had fought in 2 wars. He had buried a wife before her. He did not speak much, and when he did, his words were measured and dry, like documents being read aloud. Their marriage had settled into a kind of polite silence. She managed the household. She attended the dinners. She wore the jewels he placed on the table, without ceremony and without warmth. The other women in their circle whispered that she was lucky. A duke, a palace, security. What they did not see was the way she sat by the window each night after supper, watching the snow fall over the Neva River, wondering what her life would have looked like if her father had loved her a little more than he loved his pride. Her only real comfort was Jadwiga, her handmaid and the closest thing she had to a friend. Jadwiga was sharp-tongued, soft-hearted, and fiercely loyal in the way that only women who have survived hardship together can be. She noticed everything. She said little to others, but said everything to Miloslava in the privacy of their evenings. It was Jadwiga who had first whispered the name Glafira. And it was Jadwiga who had watched Miloslava's face carefully when she did, waiting to see if something would finally break. But Miloslava had only nodded slowly, set down her teacup, and said nothing. Because she was already carrying the one secret that would outlast all of them, and she was not yet ready for anyone to know. Glafira arrived on a Tuesday, which somehow made it worse. Not a dramatic evening, not even a particularly cold night. Just a grey Tuesday in February when the house staff moved differently, quieter, more careful, like people trying not to disturb something dangerous. Miloslava noticed it first in the way the butler avoided her eyes at breakfast, then in the way 2 of the younger maids whispered and stopped the moment she entered the corridor. By the time she reached the main drawing room, she already knew something had shifted. She just didn't know yet how far. Vsevolod was standing by the fireplace when she entered. He did not turn around immediately. That alone told her everything about the kind of conversation this was going to be. When he finally faced her, his expression was the same as always, composed, unreadable. like a man who had rehearsed his calm for so long it had become his only face. He told her simply, there was a woman, her name was Glafira Pestova. She would be staying in the East Wing. He expected the household to continue without disruption. Miloslava stood very still. She counted the roses in the wallpaper pattern behind his shoulder. 7 full blooms, 3 half open. She did this because if she looked directly at him, she was afraid of what her face might do without her permission. She asked no questions, she made no demands. She gave him the one thing he always received from her without having to ask for it, her silence. But something cracked inside her chest that morning. Not loudly, not the way glass shatters when thrown against stone. More like the way ice fractures beneath weight, slow and spreading. A sound you feel more than hear. She walked back to her room, sat at the edge of her bed and pressed both hands flat against her stomach. She had known for 3 weeks. She had told no one, not even Jadwiga. She had carried it alone, the way she carried everything. Carefully, without letting it show on her face. But now the weight of it felt different. Heavier. More urgent. Because everything had changed in the space of 10 minutes. And she needed to think. Glafira appeared at dinner that same evening. She was younger than Miloslava had imagined, perhaps 24, with pale copper hair and a soft, almost apologetic way of moving, like a woman who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She was not cruel in the way villains in stories are cruel. She did not smirk or provoke. She sat at the far end of the table and spoke only when spoken to, and there was something in her eyes when she glanced at Miloslava, something that looked almost like guilt, that Miloslava found far harder to bear than open hostility would have been. Jadwiga gripped Miloslava's wrist beneath the table once during that dinner. Just once. Brief and firm. Miloslava did not react. He lifted her wine glass with a steady hand and let the conversation move around her like water around a stone. That night, alone, she finally let herself feel it. She sat on the floor of her dressing room with her back against the wardrobe door and let the tears come without fighting them. Not because of Glafira, not even entirely because of Vsevolod, but because she was 19 years old with a child growing inside her, in a house that did not belong to her, married to a man who would never truly see her, and the only person in the world who might have protected her had sold her future to clear his debts. She cried until there was nothing left. Then she washed her face. Then she stood up. Because Miloslava had learnt something in that kitchen garden in Novgorod, the morning her father called her name and changed her life without asking. She had learned that falling apart was something you were allowed to do, but only in private, only briefly, and only if you intended to rise from it with something sharper than what broke you. She pressed her hand to her stomach again. Ugh, this child was hers. Whatever Vsevolod had brought into their home, whatever humiliation he had dressed up in politeness and presented to her as fact, he had not taken this. He did not even know it existed. And she was going to decide, very carefully, what that meant. Jadwiga found her an hour later, still standing in the dressing room, staring at nothing. The older woman looked at her face, then at her hands resting against her stomach, and her expression changed completely. She crossed the room without a word and took both of Miloslava's hands in hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jadwiga said quietly, "How long?" And Miloslava finally, for the first time since she had found out, told someone the truth. If you're still with me till this moment, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. I truly appreciate you for sticking around. 3 weeks, Miloslava told her. 3 weeks and 2 days. Jadwiga did not gasp. She did not flutter or panic the way some women would. She simply held Miloslava's hands tighter and looked at her with those steady, dark eyes that had seen too much of life to be surprised by any of it. Then she asked one more question, low and careful, the kind of question that carried the weight of everything unsaid beneath it. "Does he know?" Miloslava shook her head. Jadwiga exhaled slowly through her nose. She released Miloslava's hands, moved to the small chair by the window, and sat down with the deliberate patience of a woman organizing her thoughts before she spoke them. The candle between them threw soft, unsteady light across her face. Outside, snow was falling again over the city, silent and indifferent. "Then you have time," Jadwiga said finally. "Not much, but enough to think." That was how it began, not with a grand decision, not with a speech or a moment of fire. Just two women sitting in a candlelit room while the rest of the house slept, thinking carefully about what survival was going to require. In the days that followed, Miloslava watched. It was the one skill her years of silence had sharpened beyond anything else. She watched the way Vsevolod moved through the house, with Glafira's presence quietly rearranging everything around him. He was not warmer, exactly, but he was less absent. He lingered at the table longer. He occasionally smiled at something Glafira said in that low, careful way of hers. It was not the grand love of poetry or novels. It was something smaller and more devastating, two people who had chosen each other, existing comfortably in the same air. Miloslava watched this and felt something she had not expected. Not grief, exactly. Something closer to clarity. She had never had that with him. She had never been chosen. She had been acquired. And somewhere beneath the humiliation of the last few days, beneath the fracture she was still carrying in her chest, she understood that she had always known this, had always felt the difference, and had been too well trained in obedience to name it until now. She named it now, and naming it changed something in her spine. She began to move differently through the house, still quiet, still composed, but with a new quality to her stillness, less like submission and more like intention. She started paying attention to things she had previously ignored. The household accounts, the properties listed under the Krasnomir name, and which ones had been acquired before the marriage and which after. The legal standing of a child born within a noble marriage in the Russian imperial system. She was careful about how she gathered this information, never asking directly, never drawing attention. She borrowed books from Vsevolod's library on the pretense of boredom. She listened more attentively at dinners when the men talked about land and inheritance as though the women at the table were part of the furniture. She was not furniture anymore. She had stopped being furniture the moment she realized she was carrying something they hadn't accounted for. It was at one of these dinners that she first encountered Prince Radovan Svechin. He was a distant associate of Vsevolod's, a man of perhaps 35, with an unhurried way of speaking and eyes that were far more observant than his relaxed posture suggested. He had arrived in the city on some matter of business and had been invited to dine twice in the same week, which was unusual for Vsevolod, who did not extend social warmth easily. Miloslava noticed that Vsevolod deferred to him in subtle ways, the way powerful men only defer to those they respect or owe something to. She filed this away without knowing yet why it mattered. What she hadn't expected was for Radovan to notice her noticing. It happened during the second dinner. The men were deep in conversation, and Glafira was speaking quietly with one of the other women present. And Miloslava had been doing what she always did, listening to everything while appearing to listen to nothing. She had been watching Vsevolod's face when Radovan mentioned a particular estate near Tver, watching for the slight tightening around his eyes that told her the estate meant something significant. When she felt the shift in the room's attention, she looked up. Radovan was looking directly at her. Not in the way men usually looked at her, as an ornament or an afterthought. He was looking at her the way she looked at people, like he was reading something. His expression gave away nothing, but he inclined his head very slightly, just barely, the way one sharp mind acknowledges another across a room. Miloslava held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked away and raised her wineglass. But her heart was beating faster than it had in weeks. She told Jadwiga about it that night. Jadwiga listened with her arms folded and her mouth pressed into the thin, careful line it made when she was deciding how worried to be. "Be careful," was all she said at first. Then, a moment later, "But don't be so careful that you miss something useful." This was why Miloslava loved her. The thing she had not told Jadwiga, the thing she was still working through herself, was that the pregnancy was beginning to make itself known in ways she couldn't entirely control. The exhaustion came in sudden, overwhelming waves. Twice in the past week she had needed to grip the edge of a table to keep her face neutral when her body had tried to betray her in the middle of a public room. Her appetite had changed. Her sense of smell had become almost unbearable in the mornings, so she rearranged her schedule without explanation, appearing later and citing poor sleep, which was also true enough. She was running out of time to be invisible about it. Jadwiga had quietly contacted a woman she trusted, an older midwife who asked no questions and kept her own counsel. They had met once, briefly, in a room above a shop near the river market. The woman had examined her, confirmed what they already knew, and given Miloslava a small jar of something to help with the worst of the nausea. She had also told her, in the plain and unpitying way of experienced women, that she had perhaps 6 more weeks, maybe 8, before her body told its secret without her permission. 6 weeks. Miloslava turned this number over in her mind constantly. It measured itself against everything, against Vsevolod's obliviousness, against Glafira's quiet, expanding presence in the household, against whatever significance the estate near Tver held in her husband's careful, unexpressive face, against Radovan Svechin and what he might or might not become. She had not yet decided what to do about him. Part of her said to stay away entirely. A man with that quality of attention was dangerous simply by nature, regardless of his intentions. Another part of her, the part that had been waking slowly and steadily since the morning Vsevolod had stood by the fireplace and rearranged her life without asking, said that danger was already here, had been here for months, and that the question was no longer how to avoid it, but how to use it. She was thinking about this, sitting by the window with a book she wasn't reading, when the door to her sitting room opened without a knock. It was not Jadwiga. It was Glafira. She stood in the doorway with an expression that was difficult to read, something caught between apology and determination, and she was holding a small cloth parcel in both hands, like an offering or a peace gesture, or perhaps both at once. She met Miloslava's eyes and did not look away, which took more courage than Miloslava would have credited her with. "I wanted to speak with you," Glafira said. Her voice was softer than Miloslava had expected. "Privately, if you'll allow it." Miloslava looked at her for a long moment. Everything in her training, in her pride, in the raw, bruised place she had not yet fully examined, said to send her away. To be cold and correct and entirely unreachable. It was what this situation called for. It was what any woman of her position would have done. But Miloslava thought about what Jadwiga had said. Don't be so careful that you miss something useful. She closed the book. She gestured to the chair across from her. Glafira stepped inside and quietly closed the door behind her. And in the silence that followed, before either of them had said another word, Miloslava had the sudden and unsettling feeling that this conversation was going to matter in ways she could not yet see. That this woman she had every reason to despise might be carrying something Miloslava needed, or might need something only Miloslava could give. She did not know yet which one it was. But she had learned, slowly and at great cost, that the most dangerous moment was not when your enemy walked toward you. It was when someone you expected to be your enemy sat down across from you and looked at you like you might be the only person in the room who truly understood what it meant to be exactly where she was. Glafira did not speak immediately. She set the cloth parcel on the table between them with the careful movements of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times and was discovering, now that it was actually happening, that rehearsal had prepared her for almost nothing. Miloslava waited. She had learned patience the hard way. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind forged in years of swallowing things that deserved to be said aloud. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her face giving away nothing, and she waited. Glafira looked down at the parcel, then back up. "I know what you must think of me," she said. "You don't," Miloslava replied. It came out quieter than she intended, and more honest. Something shifted in Glafira's expression. The rehearsed part fell away. What was left was younger and considerably more frightened. She exhaled slowly. "I didn't come here to make excuses for what this is. I know what it is. I know what it costs you." She paused. "I came because there is something you need to know. Something he hasn't told you, and I think if our positions were reversed, I would want to know it." Miloslava felt the hairs on her arms rise beneath her sleeves. The estate near Tver, Glafira said quietly. Vsevolod is planning to transfer it within the next month. He has already spoken with his solicitor. Miloslava kept her face still. Inside, something cold moved through her. The estate near Tver was not simply a property. She knew this now. After weeks of careful reading and careful listening, it was the largest single asset under the Krasnomir name. More than that, under imperial law, it was the estate that would form the material foundation of any inheritance claim. Without it, a child born into the marriage would have title in name and almost nothing behind it. A child born into the marriage with the estate intact would be untouchable. To whom? Miloslava asked. Her voice was completely level. Glafira hesitated just long enough for Miloslava to understand that this was the part she had debated whether to say. To a holding managed by Prince Radovan Svechin. On paper it would appear to be a business arrangement, a loan secured against the land. She folded her hands in her lap, but it would not be reversible, not practically, not in any time frame that would matter. The room was very quiet. Miloslava looked at Glafira and thought about everything she had assumed about this woman, the guilt she had seen in those pale eyes at dinner. The apologetic quality of her movements through the house. She had read it as the discomfort of someone who knew they had caused harm. Now she wondered how much of it was something else entirely. How much of it was fear. Why are you telling me this? Miloslava asked. Glafira met her eyes directly. Because I am not what you think I am in this situation. And because whatever Vsevolod feels for me, I am not blind. I see how this house works. I see what is being built around you without your knowledge. She stopped. And because you are carrying his child. I think I have known for 2 weeks. And I think you deserve to walk out of this with something real in your hands. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Miloslava had ever sat inside. She thought about everything she had swallowed. Her father's voice in the kitchen garden. Vsevolod's composed face by the fireplace. Every dinner, every night by the window, every morning she had pressed her hands to her stomach in secret and asked herself what kind of world she was preparing to bring a child into. She thought about 6 weeks. She thought about Radovan Svechin's eyes across the dinner table, reading her, and what he had actually been calculating while she was busy calculating him. She picked up the cloth parcel. Inside were papers, not personal ones, legal ones. Copies, carefully made, of what appeared to be the early documentation of the land arrangement Glafira had described. Miloslava did not ask how she had obtained them. Some questions, she had learned, were less important than what you did with the answer. She looked up at Glafira. You took a very large risk coming here. Yes, Glafira said simply. If he finds out. I know. Another silence. Then Miloslava nodded once, slowly. The kind of nod that means something is being decided rather than agreed to. She set the papers aside and looked at the woman across from her with new and considerably more complicated eyes. Then we don't let him find out, she said. That same evening, while Vsevolod was occupied in his study with correspondence, Miloslava did something she had never done before in this house. She sent a message. Not through the formal household channels, not through anyone who reported to Vsevolod, but through the young kitchen boy who owed Jadwiga a favour and knew how to move through the city without attracting attention. The message was brief and contained nothing compromising on its surface. It was addressed to Prince Radovan Svechin and requested the honour of a brief meeting on a matter of shared acquaintance. She did not sleep that night. Not because she was afraid, though she was. But because the part of her that had been sleeping for 19 years, the part that had been buried under obedience and silence, and the long, slow grief of being used as a solution to someone else's problem, that part was now completely, irreversibly awake. And it was not quiet. It was asking questions she could no longer afford not to answer. What did she want? Not what was available to her. Not what was safe. What did she actually want? She wanted her child to be undeniable. She wanted the name they would carry to be backed by something solid enough that no one, not Vsevolod, not Radovan, not any court or creditor, or ambitious man with a pen and a solicitor, could dismantle it. She wanted to stop being managed. She wanted for the first time in her life to be the person in the room who knew the most and said the least by choice rather than by conditioning. She could do this. She understood that now. The same qualities that had made her invisible had sharpened into tools she hadn't recognized as such, because no one had ever told her that silence and observation were a form of power. They had only ever told her they were a form of compliance. The difference, she now understood, was entirely in who was choosing them. Radovan agreed to meet. It was at the home of a mutual acquaintance, arranged with enough social plausibility that it would raise no particular eyebrows. Miloslava arrived, composed and unhurried, dressed well but not conspicuously, with Jadwiga 2 steps behind her and everything she was carrying completely invisible on her face. Radovan rose when she entered the room. He was exactly as she remembered, unhurried, watchful. That quality of stillness that she now understood was not ease, but strategy. He waited until the door was closed and they were effectively alone before he said anything. "You're more direct than I expected," he said. "You've been expecting something," she replied. "That's interesting." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, closer to respect. She told him what she knew, precisely and without excess. She did not tell him how she knew it. She told him the shape of the arrangement involving the Twer estate, the timeline, and the effect it would have on her child's inheritance. She told him that she was aware of his role in the arrangement. She watched his face as she spoke. He did not deny it. He was quiet for a long moment after she finished. Then he said, "What is it you're proposing?" "I'm not proposing anything yet," Miloslava said. "I'm establishing that I know what I know, and I'm asking you one question." She held his gaze directly. "Is this your design or his?" He studied her. This was not a comfortable thing to be on the receiving end of. It felt like being read by someone who was deciding whether the book was worth finishing. Then he said, quietly, "His design. My involvement was not intended to be what it has become." "Meaning you didn't know about the child?" His expression answered before his words did. "No, I did not." She let that settle. Then she said, "Then we have more to discuss than I thought." She did not know, walking into that room, what she had expected to find in Radovan Svechin. An adversary, certainly. Possibly a tool. What she had not expected was what she saw when the composure cracked slightly. Just once. Just briefly. When she mentioned the child. Something that looked like a man recognizing a line he had not intended to cross. She filed this away. Not with warmth. With precision. Because she was no longer the woman who had stood in a kitchen garden with earth under her nails and swallowed a scream. She was not yet the woman she was going to become. But she was something clear and specific and entirely her own, standing in the middle of the distance between those two people. And she knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had paid very dearly for every piece of self-knowledge she possessed, that what happened in the next days would decide everything. She walked out of that meeting with nothing signed, nothing promised, nothing explicit. But the air between her and Radovan had rearranged itself into something neither of them had named yet. She got into the waiting carriage. Jadwiga looked at her face and said nothing. 2 blocks from the house, Miloslava said quietly. He didn't know. Jadwiga was still watching her. Does that change anything? Miloslava looked out the window at the frozen city moving past her. The Never River, the pale grey sky. The life she had been handed versus the one she was beginning, slowly, at great cost, to take. Not what needs to change, she said, but possibly how. That evening, Vsevolod came to her sitting room for the first time in weeks. He stood in the doorway with his composed, unreadable face and told her he needed to speak with her about the household accounts. It was mundane. It was deliberate. It was the kind of conversation designed to feel like normalcy. She looked at him across the room and understood, with complete and devastating clarity, that she was no longer afraid of him. She had been afraid of his indifference, of his power, of the particular cruelty of being overlooked by someone who owned your life on paper. But the fear had been feeding on her silence, and she had stopped feeding it. What she felt now was something quieter and far more dangerous. She felt awake. She felt like herself. For the first time, possibly ever. "Of course," she said pleasantly. "Sit down." He sat, She listened. She answered his questions about the accounts with precision and without nerves, and at no point did she mention the Tver estate, or Glafira's visit, or Radovan Svechin. She was not ready for him to know what she knew. But the moment she decided that, the moment she consciously chose to hold her cards, rather than scatter them in panic or grief, something in the room shifted. He looked at her, briefly, with the faintest trace of something she had never seen from him before. She didn't know if it was suspicion. She didn't know if it was seeing her, possibly for the first time. She didn't let herself wonder too long about which one she wanted it to be. The next morning, Miloslava woke before dawn. She lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to the house breathe around her. The particular silence of a place full of people who were all, in their own ways, waiting for something. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach, felt the quiet, insistent reality of what was growing there, and made the decision she had been circling for 2 weeks without landing on. She was going to tell Vsevolod about the child. Not because she wanted to, not because she trusted him with it, but because she had thought it through from every angle available to her and arrived at the same conclusion each time. A secret kept too long becomes a weapon in someone else's hand. She needed to be the one who placed this particular truth on the table, precisely when she chose, on ground she had prepared. Not because he stumbled onto it, not because a servant noticed, not because her body finally made the announcement without her permission. She had perhaps 2 more weeks before that last option became the only one. She got up. She washed her face in cold water. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time, not with vanity, but with the particular attention of someone taking inventory before a difficult journey. She looked tired. She looked older than 19. She also looked, for the first time she could remember, like someone who knew exactly where she was standing. She had Jadwiga send word to Radovan that morning. Brief, careful, coded in the language of ordinary social correspondence. She needed him to move before Vsevolod did. Whatever his original arrangement with her husband had been, she had spent 3 nights thinking through what leverage she held and how to apply it without destroying the one thing she was trying to build. She did not need Radovan to become her ally in any grand or sentimental sense. She needed him to remove himself from the Tver arrangement cleanly enough that it could not be quietly reinstated the moment her back was turned. In exchange, she would offer him something he wanted more than the land. She had worked this out carefully. Radovan was a man who moved through powerful circles but had never quite been of them. Not fully, not in the way that opened the oldest doors. The Krasnomir name, properly leveraged, could do that. Not through Vsevolod, who gave his name carefully and coldly, but through a child, an heir, the kind of godparent arrangement that meant nothing on paper and everything in practice. She was not sentimental about this. She understood that she was trading in the currency available to her, which was connection and information, and the calculated bestowal of access. It was the same currency the men around her had always traded in. They had simply never thought to explain this to the women in the room. Radovan's response came by midday. He would meet her terms. The arrangement with Vsevolod would be allowed to dissolve quietly on grounds of changed financial circumstances. He was concise about it, professional, and at the very end of his response, in a tone that was neither warm nor cold but something more precise, he said that he hoped the child would be healthy. She read that line twice. Then she set it aside and went to find her husband. Vsevolod was in his study. He looked up when she entered, and there was that same flicker she had caught the evening before, that faint, uncharacteristic attentiveness that told her something in his perception of her had shifted and he hadn't yet decided what to do with it. She closed the door behind her. She did not sit down. She told him directly. She was carrying his child. She was approximately 10 weeks along. She was in good health. She had been examined and there was no cause for concern. She watched his face while she spoke. He went very still. Not the composed, practiced stillness she was accustomed to from him, but something raw, something that moved through him before he could arrange it into something more controlled. He looked at her, and for a suspended, strange moment, she saw something in his eyes she had never seen there before. Not love. She was not going to permit herself that particular error, but something genuine. Something that recognized her, perhaps for the first time, as a person who had been present in his life all along and whom he had consistently failed to see. He said her name, just her name. The way he said it made her chest tighten. She held herself very steady and waited. He came around the desk and stood in front of her and seemed, for a long and uncharacteristic moment, not to know what to do with his hands. He was a man who had fought in wars, who had managed estates and navigated the brutalities of imperial politics. He had buried a wife and maintained his composure at the graveside. And here he was, undone by a woman he had acquired and ignored, standing in his study with grief and something like shame moving visibly across his face. He asked if she was well. He asked if she needed anything. He asked these questions in the voice of a man who knew they were insufficient and was asking them anyway because he did not yet have the vocabulary for what he actually meant. She answered him calmly. She was well. She needed nothing urgent. She had simply thought he should know. She did not mention the Twer estate. She did not mention Radovan. She did not mention Glafira. She let him carry the weight of what had just been placed between them, and she walked out of the room. The shift in the house after that was not dramatic. It was not the kind of change that announces itself. It was quieter and more pervasive, like a change in temperature, the kind you register in your body before your mind catches up. Vsevolod was more present. He appeared at meals with more consistency. He spoke to her more directly, not warmly, not with the ease of a man who had suddenly discovered tenderness, but with a new and careful respect that felt like someone handling something they had previously underestimated and were now afraid of dropping. Glafira noticed. Of course she did. She was a perceptive woman in a vulnerable position, and she had learned, presumably through difficult experience, to read a room for shifts in power. She said nothing about it to Miloslava directly, but one evening she passed her in the corridor and paused, and what passed between them was not a word but a look. The kind of look exchanged between two people who have shared a secret and survived it. Miloslava held her gaze for a moment, nodded once, and continued walking. She did not hate Glafira. This surprised her less than it might have a month ago. Hatred required a kind of investment she had decided to spend elsewhere. What she felt for her was something more complicated and less consuming. A wary, unsentimental acknowledgement. A recognition of two women navigating the same impossible geometry from different corners of it. She did not know what would become of Glafira in this house, in this life. That was not her problem to solve. But she had not forgotten what Glafira had risked in coming to her room with those papers, and she would not pretend she had. Some debts did not need to be spoken to be real. The Tver estate remained in the Krasnomir name. The arrangement with Radovan dissolved in the way these things dissolved among men of that class, quietly, attributed to shifting circumstances, with no one's dignity officially compromised. Vsevolod said nothing to her about it. She did not know how much he suspected, or whether he had simply accepted the change as the kind of fluid renegotiation that characterized business dealings at that level. She did not ask. She was learning, slowly and with great deliberateness, the difference between the things she needed to know and the things she simply wanted to know. The distinction was clarifying. It saved energy she could not afford to waste. Spring came to St. Petersburg with the particular brightness of a season that has been kept waiting too long. The ice on the Neva broke. The light changed. The city opened itself up in that sudden, extravagant way it had after months of grey and cold. And Miloslava stood at her window one morning and watched it, and felt something move through her that was not quite happiness, but was close enough to matter. She was 5 months along now. There was no concealing it and no reason to. She moved through the house and through the social world. Vsevolod required her to inhabit with the same composure as always, but the composure meant something different now. It was not a wall she had built to keep pain out. It was something she wore because she had chosen to, because it served her, because she had decided who she was, and she was no longer performing stability in the hope that someone would eventually notice. She simply was it. Jadwiga watched all of this with the quiet, undemonstrative satisfaction of a woman who had invested something in someone and was seeing the return. She said very little. She didn't need to. They had developed, over these months, a way of communicating that existed largely in silences and in the precise weight of certain looks. Miloslava trusted very few people. She trusted Jadwiga with everything she was, and that trust had been earned and kept on both sides with a seriousness that neither of them would have called love out loud, but both of them understood it to be. Vsevolod came to her sitting room one evening in April. The city was still light outside, the long northern evening stretching itself out in gold and pale blue. He sat across from her without being asked and without any stated reason for the visit, and they talked. Not about anything urgent, not about the child or the estate or anything that carried the weight of the months behind them. They talked about small things. A book she had been reading, a piece of news from Moscow, the strange particular quality of the evening light. It was the closest they had ever come to being ordinary together. She did not mistake it for a resolution of everything between them. She was not that naive, and even if she had been, she had burned that naivety off herself carefully and deliberately over the past months, and had no intention of letting it grow back. There was still too much distance in him, still too much she would never be chosen for. Still Glafira, quietly present in the East Wing, still the years of her life that had been decided for her without her consent. But she sat across from this man who had acquired her and ignored her and unwittingly handed her, by failing to see her, the space and silence in which to become someone formidable, and she found that she did not wish him harm. She wished him the specific discomfort of a man who has spent years looking past something and has begun too late and too slowly to understand what it was. She thought she was achieving that. The child moved that night, for the first time, a small interior flutter that stopped her breath. She was alone when it happened, sitting in the quiet of her room with the window open to the spring air. She put her hand to her stomach and stayed very still and felt it again. That unmistakable, impossible smallness that was nevertheless entirely real, entirely present, entirely hers. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about the kitchen garden in Novgorod. The earth under her nails, the sound of her father's voice, the long distance between that girl and this room. She thought about everything that had broken in her and everything she had made from the broken pieces, and she felt, quietly, without drama, that she had not wasted any of it. She did not know what came next. She knew the child would be born in midsummer. She knew the Krasnomir name would be on the record and the Tver estate would be behind it and the ground would be solid enough to stand on. She knew Jadwiga would be there. She knew she would handle whatever the rest of it turned out to be with the same precision and refusal to collapse that had brought her through everything that had come before. What she did not know was whether Vsevolod would ever become something more than what he was. Whether the thing she had seen in his eyes the morning she told him about the child would eventually find its way into something she could hold. She left that question open. She had learned that some questions were not puzzles to be solved, but territories to be lived in. The living was where everything real happened. She closed her eyes. The spring air moved through the room. Somewhere below, the house was settling into its evening quiet. She pressed her hand to her stomach and stayed exactly where she was, taking up space without apology, breathing in the particular silence of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side knowing her own name. It was enough. For tonight, it was more than enough. And tomorrow was already beginning. The baby came on a Thursday in July, which felt right somehow. Not a dramatic day. Not a day the city marked with anything particular. Just a long, bright summer morning that moved slowly into afternoon while Miloslava worked at the hardest thing she had ever done, and Jadwiga held her hand without flinching, and outside the windows of the Krasnomir Palace the Neva River went on shining as though nothing extraordinary was happening at all. She was wrong about midsummer by 11 days. The child arrived early and fast and loudly, which told Miloslava something about the kind of person she was already dealing with. A boy. Dark-haired, red-faced, furious at the cold air, absolutely certain that the world owed him its full attention. She held him against her chest and felt something rearrange itself inside her permanently. Not gently, not gradually, but all at once, like a wall coming down. She pressed her lips to the top of his head and breathed him in and did not try to stop the tears because there was no one watching whose opinion of her composure mattered in this moment. Jadwiga was watching, of course. But Jadwiga's opinion of her composure had stopped mattering in the way it once had, because it had transformed into something closer to love, and love did not require performance. They named him Miroslav. It had been her choice. Vsevolod had offered two names, both from his family's history, both carrying the weight of men who had come before. She had listened to both with appropriate consideration and then said quietly, but without room for negotiation, that she would like to name him Miroslav. Vsevolod had looked at her for a moment, that new quality of attention he had been wearing since the morning she told him about the pregnancy, and then he had nodded. She had not expected the nod to cost her anything emotionally. It did, not in a painful way, in the way of something unexpectedly, carefully offered. She filed it away. She had become very good at filing things away. Miroslav changed the house in the way only a baby can, which is to say, completely and without asking permission. The sound of him moved through the rooms differently than anything had before. The staff reorganized itself around his schedule without being told. Even the older housekeeper, a woman of a movable routine who had managed the Krasnomir household for 16 years and regarded change with the specific hostility of someone whose entire sense of order depended on things staying where they were, even she could be found occasionally lingering near the nursery doorway with an expression that was not quite softness but was the closest she had come to it in recent memory. Vsevolod visited the nursery on the second morning. Miloslava was there when he arrived, sitting in the low chair by the window, with Miroslav half asleep against her shoulder. She watched her husband cross the room and stand over the small wrapped form of his son, and she saw, clearly and without sentimentality, what passed across his face. It was not the face of a man performing fatherhood for an audience. There was no one else in the room. It was something private and complicated. Something that moved through him the way feeling moves through people who have kept themselves at a remove from it for so long that when it finally arrives, it arrives as confusion as much as anything else. He reached out and touched the baby's hand with one finger. Miroslav's fingers, which were tiny and absurdly perfect and entirely without reservation, closed around it. Miloslava looked away. She looked out the window at the summer garden and gave her husband the privacy of that moment because it was the right thing to do and because she was beginning to understand, slowly and without romanticizing it, that generosity was not something you extended only to people who had earned it. Sometimes it was simply what a complicated situation required, and you gave it not for them but for the version of the story you were choosing to live in. She did not forgive him on that morning. Forgiveness was a longer road than that. And she was not sure she had finished walking it, and she was not sure it mattered whether she did or didn't, so long as she was moving in the direction she had chosen. But something in the room was different after that moment, with Miroslav's hand around his father's finger. Something shifted that she didn't have an exact name for. Something that was not reconciliation but was not entirely the absence of it either. Glafira left the house in September. It was not a dramatic departure. There were no confrontations, no scenes, no final exchange of charged looks in doorways. One morning she was present at breakfast, quiet and careful as always, and within 2 weeks she was gone. Miloslava did not ask Vsevolod about it directly. She heard from Jadwiga, who heard from the second housemaid, who had overheard what was probably not intended to be overheard, that the arrangement had ended by mutual agreement, whatever that meant. Whatever it actually looked like behind closed doors. On the morning after Glafira's departure, Miloslava found a small package outside her sitting room door. Inside was the copper brooch she had once seen Glafira wearing, the one shaped like a leaf, simple and old, and clearly personal. There was no note. She had asked for no letter and received none. Just the brooch wrapped in cloth, left without explanation. She held it for a long time. Then she placed it in the small wooden box on her dressing table where she kept the things that mattered. Not because she had resolved everything she felt about Glafira or about what that chapter of her life had been, but because the woman had walked into her room carrying the truth at considerable risk to herself, and that was not nothing, and Miloslava had decided, firmly and deliberately, that she was going to be the kind of person who acknowledged what was not nothing. Radovan Svechin attended Miroslav's christening. This was Vsevolod's invitation, not hers. But she had known it would happen and had prepared herself for the particular complexity of standing in a gilded room holding her son, while the man who had been intended to strip her child's inheritance watched the ceremony with his composed, measuring eyes. She had dressed carefully that morning. She had worn the blue gown, the one that had never yet failed her in any room she had needed to hold. She had carried herself the way she had learned to carry herself, not as performance, not as armor, but as fact. When Radovan approached her after the ceremony, he looked at the baby in her arms and then at her, and something in his expression was quieter than she had seen it before. Less strategic, more human. He said, "He looks strong." She said, "He is." They held that for a moment. Then Radovan said, with no preamble and no social softening, "You handled everything with more skill than most men I have negotiated with." She looked at him evenly. "I had good reasons." He inclined his head, that same acknowledgement she had seen across the dinner table months ago. One sharp mind recognizing another. Only now there was less distance in it, less calculation. She did not know what Radovan's fetching would become in the years ahead. She was not naive enough to think that a man of his nature had simply been transformed by a few months of being outmaneuvered. But she believed, based on everything she had observed and everything she had read about him through his actions rather than his words, that he was a man who respected what he could not easily counter. And she intended to remain for as long as it was necessary, exactly that. Autumn came to the city slowly that year, as if reluctant to let summer go. Miloslava found her new ordinary in the small and specific rhythms of days, that were hers in a way nothing had been before. Miroslav at dawn, warm and insistent, and completely uninterested in anyone's schedule but his own. Jadwiga in the mornings with tea and the particular companionship of a friendship that had stopped needing to justify itself. The household accounts, which she now managed with an authority she had claimed rather than been given, and which no one had tried to reclaim from her. The weekly correspondence she had begun to maintain with her sister Darinka in Novgorod, letters that were longer and more honest than anything they had exchanged, while Miloslava was still the daughter who had been successfully married off and therefore safely not thought about. Darinka had asked, in one of her letters, whether Miloslava was happy. Miloslava had sat with that question for 3 days before answering it. She had written back that she was not sure happiness was the right frame for where she was, that she was clear, that she was grounded, that she had a child she loved with a ferocity that still surprised her with its force, and a self she had built from materials the world had not intended her to have access to, and a future that was genuinely hers to determine, in a way she had not believed was possible for a woman in her position. That some morning she stood at the window with Miroslav in her arms and the light coming off the river and felt something so large and quiet moving through her that she didn't have a word for it, and that perhaps that was close enough. She sent the letter and did not second guess it. Vsevolod was not transformed. She had never expected him to be, and she did not want the version of the story that required him to be. What he was, slowly and imperfectly, and with the specific awkwardness of a man learning to see something he had looked past for years, was present, more present than he had been. He asked about the baby with genuine interest. He occasionally asked about her, which was newer and stranger, and she received it without either warmth or coldness, simply as information, as data about the ongoing shifts in a complicated arrangement that she was no longer at the mercy of. Whether they would ever be in any real sense partners, she did not know. She left that open. She had learned to leave things open that were not yet finished. It was less exhausting than forcing conclusions, and she had energy she needed to spend elsewhere. One evening in November, she put Miroslav to sleep herself, which she did whenever the day allowed it, and stood for a long time watching him breathe in the candlelit quiet of the nursery. He was 4 months old, and already had a way of looking at the world around him that reminded her of someone. It took her several moments to realize the person he reminded her of was herself. That particular focused attention, that sense of taking in information and not immediately showing what was being done with it. She smiled at that, alone in the room with no one to see it. She walked to the window. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall over the city, soft and unhurried, settling on the river and the streets and the rooftops with the same impartiality it gave to everything. She watched it and thought about the girl in the kitchen garden in Novgorod, the earth under her nails, the scream she had swallowed. She thought about everything that had been taken from her and everything she had taken back, and everything she had built in the space between. In the silence, no one had thought to look inside. She was 20 years old. She had a son whose name would outlast every arrangement that had tried to diminish him before he was even born. She had a self that no one had given her and no one could take. She had Jadwiga and Dorinka's letters and the particular knowledge of her own mind that comes only to people who have been tested by something real. She did not know what the next year would bring. She did not know what Vsevolod would choose. She did not know what Radovan's continued presence in their social world would eventually require of her. She did not know whether the house would hold, or change, or become something she hadn't anticipated. But she knew herself, and she had learned, at the cost of everything soft and unguarded that she had once been, that knowing yourself was not the beginning of safety. It was something better. It was the beginning of power, real power, the kind no one can arrange away or transfer on paper or dissolve quietly on grounds of changed financial circumstances. The snow kept falling. Miroslav breathed. She stayed at the window a little longer, not because she was waiting for anything, but because the moment was hers, and she had decided to take up space inside it, and she was no longer in any hurry to leave a room simply because the room had not been designed with her in mind. She would redesign it herself. She already had. And she was only just beginning. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it honestly. Have you ever stayed silent about something that was slowly costing you everything? Have you ever carried something so heavy and so alone that the weight of it changed who you were without you even noticing? Miloslava's story is not just a story from another century. It is the story of every woman who was told that her silence was grace, when really it was survival, that her stillness was strength, when really it was the only option she had been given. And then one day she stopped waiting for permission and became someone they hadn't prepared for. If this story moved something in you, if you felt any part of her in yourself, then you are exactly who this channel was made for. Please subscribe, share, and write your thought concerning the story.